So we'll continue with this story of kind of God and his people and the idea of Jewishness, what it means to be Jewish, um, what is Judaism. And we were talking about that kind of central figure, that one God, that God that was something totally other, the I am, that tetragrammaton, Yahweh, and that absoluteness, that otherness, and at the same time, his concern and his compassion, his involvement in history, being the God of your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Um, but there are some scholars that argue against this idea that early on that there was a sense of one God. It's not a huge deal because the seeds of the monotheism that we understand in the Judeo-Christian and Islamic religions of today are there in the earliest scriptures, even if the first followers of this kind of Hebrew faith, even if the first Abrahamic peoples didn't fully understand what was going on. The ones who kind of pulled together these scriptures are clearly monotheistic. Traditionally, obviously Christians, Muslims, Jews, for the most part, would say that no, Abraham was fully monotheistic. He understood one God. Some Christians and Jews might say, well, Abraham didn't fully understand, but God in his mercy worked with Abraham where he was. What some scholars focus on is the idea that at the first, the Hebrew peoples were henotheistic, not monotheistic. And henotheistic is not exactly like polytheism. Polytheism is this idea that there are many gods, and you can kind of choose one or choose multiple to worship. Henotheism is this idea that there may be many gods, but our God, our one God, this is the best, the biggest, the strongest. He's something kind of other from the other gods. So it's kind of a technical question of, are there really other gods, or are the other gods not really anything at all? And you find verses and passages in the Hebrew scriptures and later in the Christian scriptures that kind of pull at a tension between these two ideas. You'll find where God sits above the council of gods, or the accuser, Satan, the spiritual being, will come before God, or the sons of God sing together at creation. And so that could point at a kind of henotheism. At the same time, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of Moses, is still something so entirely different that he's seen as the maker, the creator of those. But it's good to realize that there is this sense of henotheism, a God above the gods, or is there only one God and nothing else? That'll come to play later too, is are there other spiritual beings? And we'll discuss that a little later. That question is an issue for some developments within Judaism itself. Within Christianity, we'll see that the Apostle Paul at one point says that these idols that other people worship, in line with the Jewish tradition that says they're just stone and rock and metal. They have mouths, but they can't speak. They have ears, but they can't hear. They have eyes, but they can't see. They're not really, truly anything. It's silly and stupid to worship them. And on the one hand, the Apostle Paul basically says that about them. We know these other gods aren't really anything. But at another point, in kind of intention, and in the same letters, oftentimes the Apostle Paul will say, we know these are demons. And so he's essentially saying there are these spiritual beings, but they're not like God. In fact, James says there are demons, and demons fear and tremble. And early Christians and many Jews would believe in angels, angelic beings. But the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God that Moses preaches, is something entirely other. Whether there are other small g gods and goddesses that exist is really secondary and unimportant. And part of the kind of polemic story about who this God is as something totally other than the gods of the nations is seen not only in creation, but also in the Exodus and the plagues. This is a very clear point in the plague stories, in the Exodus, the people being freed from Egypt. They're enslaved, they're abused, they're oppressed, their sons have been taken and murdered. Um, they're the severity of treatment, it's horrible. And God steps in to rescue them. And if you don't understand what's going on in this story, you would think, oh, this is kind of brutal. Why is he doing all these horrible, mean things, people? Um, but if you look at the kind of the plagues of Jehovah, it takes that Yod He Wah He and puts in the vowels for the Hebrew word Adonai, which means Lord. Um, but this God of the Hebrews, in the plagues, he takes on various Egyptian gods. Um, so you see these Egyptian gods that are gods of different things, or sometimes even have the form of different things. And each of these plagues attacks until you get to well, you start with the river, which Osiris is one of the main gods, turns to blood. Um, you get down to the bottom, you have darkness. Ra is the sun god, and the sun becomes dark. And finally, when you get to the death of the firstborn, what's the point of this one? Well, in large part, Pharaoh himself is a god. So it's a polemic political attack upon the validity of Pharaoh. It shows he's neither a god, and evidently this Pharaoh is not even the firstborn, because all the firstborn are killed. It's also a retribution for killing the sons of Israel. So it's a retribution against someone believed to be a god. So this is the idea behind the plagues, is that this one God of the Hebrews is superior to all the gods of Egypt. So that's God, but what about the people? What about this figure Moses? I've referenced him. Moses, as the kind of orator of God, the prophet of God, the one who meets God in the bush. What's so special about him, and what can we learn about this Hebrew faith, about being the people of God, about what God is like? Because we might be tempted to think, well, yeah, God is something other, but here's Moses. He's kind of like this magician. He's powerful. Isn't he doing these things? But the Hebrew text is very clear on even making distinction between their greatest prophet and God. Think about this. How does Moses' mother save him from Pharaoh? Right? She places him in a basket and puts pitch. So you got pitch in it so it'll float, and she sets him in the river. Interestingly, the language, we don't have a lot of time to go into all of it, but the language of this telling is very purposeful. A Jewish literature scholar, Robert Alter, talks about how the language of the saving of Moses by his mother is very intentional and very almost military, planned, strategic. The basket is built, it's made, it's coated with pitch. Moses is placed in it. It's a very purposeful. He's placed among the reeds. It's not like the if you ever saw the Prince of Egypt animated movie, it's not like he's just sent flying down the river through crocodiles and hippopotami. He's placed in a specific place in the river among the reeds. And his sister, in the Hebrew it says Miriam, is stationed. She's set there as a guard over him to watch and see what happens. So that some scholars have even thought that in this story she's purposely planting Moses to be discovered by this princess. I've even seen some conjecture that if you think about ancient rulers and their princes and princesses and how marriages worked, it's quite possible that this princess isn't even Egyptian. Perhaps she's from a warring or a competing empire, which might explain why Moses' mother does what she does, if she is being that intentional. Because one of the key empires is the Sumerians. The Sumerians have a legend of a great leader who's found floating. He's the son of a god. He's found floating down the river in a basket, and he's taken to the king's household, and eventually he assassinates that king and becomes king himself. So I've seen some scholars that are even like, hey, if this story is real, it's actually a clever woman who may be kind of planting an idea in maybe this foreign, princess who's been betrothed off to some pharaoh, that, this could inspire the story, the actions of Moses' mother, of the Pharaoh's daughter, of all this, right? So you have this, but these questions come up, in this. If there is an understanding of that Sumerian story, there's a distinction between Moses and Sargon, the Sumerian ruler, who that happened to, according to the story, and that Sargon is supposed to be the child. He's a mysterious child, and he's supposed to have this mysterious heritage from the gods. Whereas Moses, in the story, we know his mother and father by name. We know what tribe he's from. And in fact, throughout the story, in the midst of all the amazing things that Moses does, the Bible consistently refers to him like it has no other hero. It doesn't do this with the other heroes of the faith. It calls him the man Moses again and again, almost as if to emphasize, don't get confused here. The point of the story is God. Moses is just the tool. Moses is the prophet. Moses is the servant. God is the one moving this. It's the man Moses. That's important to understand about the sensibilities of Jews in relation to their leaders and to holy men and to what it means to be a servant of God. This is going to be part of the tension when Christianity begins to form. Jesus is setting himself as something above Moses at certain points in the Gospels. So it's just really profound to think about and keep in mind. And that in mind too, we want to come back to constantly this question of God being that way, God's relation to his servants being the way it is. And we see Moses. Moses is not the special one. God is special. Moses is simply one who's obeying God, right? So what does it mean to be the people of God? Well, Deuteronomy in the Pentateuch, in those first 5 books, it says, "For you are a holy people to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for his own possession. Out of all the peoples are on the face of the earth." A holy people, a set apart people, a different people. And so this is what these laws are all about. You're going to be different because of who I am. So that's kind of what's going on in the earliest stories. Is who is this God? Who are his people? What does it mean to be his people? And we see this period of failure again and again under the judges. And we talked about that a little bit in the previous part of this. But we get, after the period of the judges, we get a king. And this kingly line is a response to the kind of problems seen in the book of Judges, where there was no king in the land and everybody really screwed everything up. So you get Saul, who's a king, but he messes it up. Then you get David, who is not his son, who becomes king. And this sets up the line of Judah. We saw that Judaism comes from that tribe Judah. This is why it's Judah. Judah is the tribe of David, who is the second king, but considered the kind of the foundational, the great king, the best king that Israel had. He's the image of a godly king. Now, he fails. He has his own failures. And then his son comes along and builds a temple for God. This elaborate, massive, gorgeous temple. But Solomon is something of a failure. And after Solomon, his son tries to maintain his high taxes and his high... Solomon does a lot of things that a king of Israel is not supposed to do. And he's honored because he's David's son. But he's very... there are a lot of problems with his rule. And so his son tries to maintain his harshness, and the 10 northern tribes of Israel break off and found their own kingdom. The tribe of Judah and Benjamin remains as part of the tribe of Judah in the south, and that becomes referred to as the nation of Judah, whereas the 10 northern tribes are called Israel. So this is why we'll see that it's the nation of Judah that's going to persist, and why we'll see Judaism become the term for the faith.